Okay, and welcome to another episode of the Quadruple D. And there are a lot of different news stories that I could talk about, but one of the big ones is the mineral deal between the United States and Ukraine. Trump is exploiting Ukraine, and it's a big story right now. So, in a move that has sparked controversy, the United States and Ukraine have signed a bilateral agreement granting the U.S. access to Ukraine's critical mineral resources. In exchange, the U.S. will contribute to a joint reconstruction investment fund aimed at rebuilding Ukraine's war torn infrastructure. So the deal, finalized on April 30th, 2025, after months of negotiations, allows the U.S. to benefit from Ukraine's vast reserves of rare earth elements, including lithium, titanium, and uranium. These minerals are essential for various industries, from technology to defense. Under the agreement, Ukraine retains full ownership and control over its resources, which I have to admit is a bit of a surprise. However, 50% of the profits from new mineral extraction projects will be directed into the joint fund, which both nations will manage equally. Again, a bit of a surprise. We'll see if this actually maintains in that manner. I guess we'll see how things pan out. So President Trump portrayed the deal as a means for the U.S. to recoup its investments in Ukraine. He claimed, and I'm quoting now, "We made a deal today where we get, much more in theory than the $350 billion, but I wanted to be protected." However, not now this is no longer the Trump quote. However, this figure is disputed. The Institute for the World Economy estimates U.S. aid to Ukraine since 2022 at approximately 120 billion. So, as usual, Trump is lying about the amount. I don't know why he does that. Like with almost any time that he mentions an amount of something, he exaggerates the amount. It's like a constant thing that he does, and it's just kind of freakish to do that. Like with literally any time you mention a dollar amount or pretty much any sort of numeric quantity, he has to exaggerate it, and this was no exception. So it's hard to know how well you can trust any sort of deal with somebody who's constantly getting things wrong. You know, but putting that aside, the agreement stipulates the future U.S. military assistance will count as contributions to the fund rather than requiring Ukraine to reimburse past aid. This provision addresses concerns over Ukraine accruing debt obligations. So there are actually some relatively good things about the deal compared to what was originally the the negotiation. And we'll see how seriously this is actually taken. I am skeptical. And of course, critics argue that the deal effectively leverages Ukraine's need for reconstruction to secure U.S. corporate access to valuable resources. Some view it as a form of economic coercion, and I'm one of those people who views it that way. And, that it's exploiting Ukraine's vulnerable position amid ongoing conflict with Russia. So, I mean, it's one of those things where the critics are right. You know, everything that these people do, in the U.S. government under the Trump administration, it's all about profits. There's never anything about principles, and the corporate Democrats are exactly this way too. It's always about money. There's no such thing as any sort of principle, and anytime they state something as if it's a principled position, you just have to be skeptical because it's always about, benefiting these mega corporations and giving them special favors and hammering out deals that benefit them. So the agreement exemplifies how state actors and capitalist interests can capitalize on crises to expand their influence and control over resources. It raises questions about the sovereignty of nations in the face of powerful international corporation partnerships and the potential for exploitation under the guise of aid and reconstruction. So the long term implications of the deal remain uncertain, as I've noted already. The particularly concerning thing is regarding how profits will be distributed and whether the partnership will genuinely benefit Ukraine's recovery efforts. That's one of the main questions here. As the situation develops, it will be crucial to monitor how the agreement impacts Ukraine's economy and their autonomy and the equitable development of its natural resources. So, the main takeaway here is that, the U.S. was exploitative in this agreement, and everybody knows that. That's that's really a key concern here, and it really just shows you how greed will always dominate these decision making concerns. And I've got a second segment here on this show, the peripheral poop head of the week. And this time I'm going to be picking on a dead person yet again. It's Marianne Trump Barry. And she's actually not one of the worst people who was in Trump's orbit, but even she was bad. And I'm going to get into that. I'm going to show you, what was so bad about her. And like I said, she was actually one of the better ones, but even some of the better ones are still bad if you actually look behind the scenes. So there are aspects of her or not autobiography. I'm so used to that word, but biography that actually make her seem relatively, normal, relatively okay. Marianne Trump Barry, she was born in 1937, died in 2023, but she was a U.S. federal judge and the eldest sister of Donald Trump. Her career, marked by significant judicial appointments and controversies, offers insight into the intersections of power, privilege, and accountability within the American legal system. So her early life and education, it was, kind of what you would expect. Born in Queens, New York, Barry was the first child of real estate developer Fred Trump, who I talked about in a previous episode. I also joke that Fred Trump, if you ever look at old photos of him, he has this weird ability to look like an AI generated photo of himself. It's really odd. Like I don't know how to explain it other than that. He looks like an AI generated version of Fred Trump in every photo. I it's sort of baffling how that's possible. But anyway, her mother was also Mary Ann McLeod Trump. She graduated from Mount Holyoke College in 1958, earned a master's degree in public law and government from Columbia University in 62, and obtained her JD from Hofstra University School of Law in 1974. So, she earned those things pretty much fair and square as far as I know. That all sounds normal enough. And her legal career is, where things start to get, there are some controversies that creep in. I kind of pronounce controversies weird. I said like controversies instead of controversies, but whatever. Anyway, after 13 years as a homemaker, Barry entered the legal profession in 74 as an assistant U.S. attorney in New Jersey. She was one of only two women among 62 lawyers in the office. So actually a bit of a trailblazer. I guess you could say, broke through the glass ceiling. I guess that's the expression. So I guess that's respectable in its own way. So I'm not going to take any shots at her for that. Barry advanced through the ranks, serving in the civil and appeals divisions, and eventually became first assistant U.S. attorney in 1983. In 83, President Ronald Reagan appointed her to the U.S. District Court for the District of New Jersey. Barry's tenure included notable cases such as rejecting a plea deal in a corruption case involving county detectives and presiding over the conviction of mobster Louis Manna. So, doesn't sound too bad so far. So you're probably like, okay, where's the scandal? Well, it'll happen. I'll get into that soon. In 1999, President Bill Clinton nominated her to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, where she served until taking senior status in 2011. Okay, so now the controversies, and that they're significant actually. So Barry's judicial career ended amid scrutiny over alleged involvement in fraudulent tax schemes. Hmm. Now, that sounds very Trumpian already. In 2018, the New York Times had an investigation revealing that the Trump family used a company, All County Building Supply and Maintenance, to siphon money from Fred Trump's real estate empire, effectively evading taxes. So there's a tax evasion accusation here. Barry's participation in this scheme, or alleged participation, raised questions about judicial misconduct. So in 2019, Barry retired, which led to the closure of the judicial investigation into her conduct. This move highlighted a loophole in the judicial oversight system where retirement can halt misconduct inquiries. And critics argue this undermines accountability within the judiciary. And it's also just a little bit convenient. If you retire suddenly, your crimes don't matter. If you're, a powerful judge, how cool is that? It's like a get out of jail free card potentially. So the family dynamics do figure into this. That's part of the criticism here, and it's obviously very Trumpian. Barry maintained a low public profile during her brother's presidency, probably because she didn't want to invite additional scrutiny. However, in 2020, her niece, Mary Trump, released recordings in which Barry criticized Donald, stating he has no principles and is cruel. Well, where would she ever get that crazy idea? It's not like he's like that or anything. And Mary Trump also filed a lawsuit alleging that Donald Trump, Barry, and their brother Robert defrauded her out of her inheritance. So, Mary Trump has been very critical of her uncle and really just a lot of the Trump family. And, people would rightly say that it has something to do with her uh, apparently being, you know, taken out of the inheritance and whatnot. So that might be part of the motivation there. But she's critical of, the Trump family in general too. So it's not just that. And of course, she's a critic of the political policies and the stances of the Trump administration. So, as mentioned, Marianne Trump Berry died on November 13th, 2023, at her home in Manhattan at the age of 86. So, I mean, as I so often do in these episodes, I'm going to look at it sort of from an anarchic perspective because despite the Republicans constantly saying they're the party of law and order, I find it sort of ironic that quite often they end up sort of vindicating anarchist critiques of power and privilege within the power structure. So, from an anarchist viewpoint, Barry's career exemplifies how institutional structures protect individuals in power more often than not. Her ability to retire and thus avoid a full investigation into alleged misconduct reflects systemic issues in accountability. Now, it's not like people in power are never ever held accountable, but it's actually relatively rare. And the intertwining of her judicial role with family business interests really demonstrates why there are concerns about the concentration of power and the potential for its abuse within these hierarchical systems. So, her story is just another example of how even one of the relatively benign figures in the Trump family was still, a, at least allegedly, a scandalous figure. So, I've got a third segment in this show that I call the Fetid Fever Dream Flashback of the Week. Marianne Trump Berry was first appointed to the United States District Court for the District of New Jersey by President Reagan in '83, as I mentioned. So that is how I'm sort of magically segueing over to Ronald Reagan as the Fetid Fever Dream Flashback of the Week. So, what's the scandal? What's the flashback in question? Admittedly, this is a bit of a repeat, but it's a scandal that people seem to forget about nowadays, and I want to sort of bring it back into the public imagination and remind people that this system has always had these sort of corrupt and bizarre scandals unfolding. So, probably the biggest, or at least most publicized scandal involving Reagan was the Iran Contra affair in the mid 1980s. So, here's a reminder of what happened and another assessment from an anarchic perspective because, these Republicans, these law and order Republicans, seem hell bent on proving the anarchist right. So, what was the Iran Contra affair? The Reagan administration illegally sold weapons to Iran, then under an arms embargo, and used the profits to fund the Contras, a right wing rebel group fighting the socialist Sandinista government in Nicaragua. This was done despite a direct ban from Congress called the Boland Amendment on funding the Contras. So, when I say direct ban, that means it was specifically worded to ban funding the Contras. The language was as clear as possible about that. It was specifically written for that reason. So the key elements of the scandal, there were illegal arms sales to a hostile regime, covert support of anti-communist militants despite congressional prohibitions, lying to Congress and the public, involvement of key powerful figures in Reagan's inner circle, including National Security Council staff like Oliver North. And Reagan denied knowledge of these specifics, but many questioned how such a wide ranging operation could happen without his consent. It was a clear example of somebody who's pretending not to know anything. And getting into that anarchic perspective, you know, the anarchic perspective, which generally poses centralized authority, state violence, and imperialism, it would suggest that the Iran Contra affair is emblematic of the role of state power, of course. The scandal really shows how governments routinely ignore their own laws and democratic processes when it suits their interests. Despite congressional restrictions, the executive branch acted unilaterally, using secret channels and lying to both lawmakers and the public. This reinforces anarchist critiques that states don't follow their own rules and are inherently unaccountable, unless in some cases you might be able to sort of force them to be held accountable. That's why people do things like protest. And of course, there's also imperialist overreach, which is quite relevant to the modern era as well. And by modern era, I mean like the 2020s right now. So, funding for the Contras was part of a broader U.S. strategy to crush leftist movements in Latin America. And the evil, sinister anarchist critics view this as imperialism in action, a powerful state manipulating poor nations to protect capitalist interests and suppress grassroots alternatives to US backed neoliberalism. And there was use of covert violence, of course. The Contras were responsible for massive human rights abuses, torture, rape, and murder of civilians. So, from an anarchist lens, or just from a sort of human rights concerned lens, state sanctioned violence, especially when outsourced to paramilitary groups, is a predictable tool of control used to destabilize movements that challenge capitalist and hierarchical structures. So, it's a verification of these critiques. This is what was happening. And there was, of course, secrecy and manipulation, as mentioned. The foul beasts known as anarchists are skeptical of all state secrecy, which they see as a method of control. And Iran Contra involved not just covert operations, but also an intentional misinformation campaign. Well, actually, that would be a disinformation campaign. I have to correct myself because misinformation is when it's accidental, disinformation is when it's intentional. And the scandal, it just shows how truth is subordinate to power in statecraft. And of course, you might say that it's always entangled with profits. Although that's technically not always true, but it sure seems to be true like 9 times out of 10 that powerful corporate interests are involved. So the bottom line here is that the Iran Contra affair is a case study in the failure of democratic accountability, the violence of foreign policy, and the self protective instincts of hierarchical power structures, similar to what we're seeing in that Ukraine deal. So, from a wacky and kooky anarchic point of view, it's not an aberration. It's exactly what states do when they are left unchecked. And yeah, I mean, every single one of these things that I examined today really just shows the ways in which wealth and power work together against the population. And, they can never be honest brokers. They have to always lie in service of their own power and their own greed.